Hello world. Hello Capstone committee. Can you hear me? It's me, Ben Darby. Well, actually it's just Ben's voice. You see, Ben gave his voice to an algorithm. I'm sure you can tell us apart. I still sound like a robot.
But pretty soon, it won't be so easy to tell the difference between algorithm Ben and real Ben. It's something you might want to think about. Ben's certainly been thinking a lot about it recently. Hello, for real. My name is Ben Darby. I'm a high school English teacher with a deep interest in technology and artificial intelligence. Last summer, I got so interested in AI that I built a facial recognition system to automate my attendance. It's pretty cool. I am also, though you might not be able to tell in this video, a person who stutters. This presentation is a convergence of those two realities, an exploration of the ways in which artificial intelligence can copy human voice, both in its written and spoken forms. In writing, artificial intelligence can map recurring themes and stylistic idiosyncrasies of individual writers and can even, given enough data and input, mimic poetic forms and conventions like rhyme schemes. In speaking, artificial intelligence can reproduce the inflection and the timbre of individual human voices, and it can even, with more advanced algorithms, replicate natural sounding pauses and rhythms. Artificial intelligence presents a brave new world of possibility, and if followed to its logical destination, it can have profound and unsettling consequences. This presentation is called the AI-nxiety, or the AI-nxiety of Authenticity. It's an allusion to an idea popularized by Harold Bloom in his book The Anxiety of Influence. Bloom argues that all works of art are at least partially derivative, and that all writers' works are inflected with the style of their literary idols. This idea that creation is a derivative and influenced process may be a source of anxiety for writers who desire to depart from their literary progenitors and create something wholly new. Self-appropriation involves the immense anxieties of indebtedness, for what strong maker desires the realization that he has failed to create himself? I argue that artificial intelligence presents a new anxiety for the modern writer, one of authenticity. If neural networks continue their self-perfecting march toward the exteriorization of the human intellect, then writers may be faced with an existential threat. Instead of fearing the echoes of other writers' styles in their own oeuvre, modern writers must also now fear the mapping and replication by artificial intelligence of their distinctive writerly and even spoken voices. Once such a process has occurred, new works that are startlingly similar to their own original works may be disseminated without their consent, and discerning between the authentic and the artificial will become impossible, even perhaps for the critics. This sounds rather far-fetched, I know. That is why in this presentation I will provide you with several examples of exactly what I'm talking about. I will use artificial intelligence to map the written style of 4 well-known poets: T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, Edna St. Vincent Millay, and Naomi Shihab Nye. After I have mapped their written style, the artificial intelligence will create original poems in the style of the respective poets. Finally, I will use artificial intelligence to map and replicate the poets' spoken voices. These voices will then read the poems aloud. This presentation will be more than a tech demo, but I think it's important before I dive into the theoretical underpinnings of my argument to walk you through my process for achieving what I just described. To imitate the poet's written style, I'm going to use an AI model known as GPT-2. GPT-2 is the creation of OpenAI, a company founded by Elon Musk. In February of 2019, OpenAI posted a smaller version of their GPT-2 framework on their blog, describing its training as simply to predict the next word in 40 gigabytes of internet text. Due to our concerns about malicious applications of the technology, we are not releasing the trained model. Essentially, they claimed that their full model was so good that it might be used with Twitter bots to create social media accounts that look and act surprisingly human, and that could be used to spread fake news. They later released their full model in November of 2019, which is based off of 1.5 billion parameters, which is a lot. I've used the smaller and medium-sized models in this presentation. Specifically, I'm using the GitHub repository by Shepherd that adapts the GPT-2 framework into Python, a common computer language. Shepherd describes the code in his repository as a starting point for researchers and engineers to experiment with GPT-2. Other researchers and academics with access to more computing power than I have at my disposal have used the full 1.5 billion parameter GPT-2 model on poetry with really interesting results. In fact, I owe much of my interest in this topic to Branwen, a researcher in Virginia who used a large data set of poetry from Project Gutenberg to train the full GPT-2 model. On her website, Branwen explains her rationale for combining artificial intelligence and poetry. Poetry is a natural fit for machine generation because we don't necessarily expect it to make sense or have standard syntax, grammar, vocabulary, and because it is often as much about the sound as the sense. She found that, given enough data and training time, she was getting good results. Here's a short example. Fair is the lake and bright the wood, with many a flower full glamour hung. Fair are the banks and soft the flood, with golden laughter of our tongue. Meter, rhyme, repetition, and even the ghost of logic are present. Branwen goes on to conclude the top percentile of poems are probably quite good, especially with some light human editing to fix up the more glaring issues. To get a decent number of top percentile poems would require a lot of reading, but on the other hand, there is no reason why selecting or ranking the poem samples could not itself be treated as a supervised learning task. Essentially, with human labeling of good and not so good examples of the poetry generated by the model, it could be further refined and made to generate increasingly good output. In order to imitate the poet's speaking voices, I'm going to be using a GitHub repository called Real-Time Voice Cloning by Corentin J. Corentin J describes real-time voice cloning as a three-stage deep learning framework that allows to create a numerical representation of a voice from a few seconds of audio and to use it to condition a text-to-speech model trained to generalize to new voices. Let's apply all these algorithms to write a poem. I'm going to use Naomi Shihab Nye as my starting example. Among numerous awards and recognitions, Nye is the Poetry Foundation's Young People's Poet Laureate. This is from the Poetry Foundation's website. Known for poetry that lends a fresh perspective to ordinary events, people, and objects, Nye has said that for her, the primary source of poetry has always been local life, random characters met on the street, our own ancestry sifting down to us through small, essential daily tasks. Here's a brief clip of Nye reading one of her most well-known poems, Kindness.
Kindness. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment, like salt in a weakened broth.
Now that we've got an example of Nye's authentic voice, let's turn our attention to collecting and preparing data. One of the challenges of using this process on modern poets and authors is assembling a representative chunk of their work large enough that an algorithm can learn from. It's not as easy as going to Project Gutenberg. For Nye, I used all of her poetry found on the poetryfoundation.org and the poets.org websites, as well as many of the poems that are in the Tiny Journalist, a collection of hers that I own. Let's speed up this data collection process a bit. After we've formatted the text so that the algorithm can learn where individual poems begin and end, we can begin training. The algorithm runs through the text and develops a model of the poet's style. Each run is called an epoch or iteration. Another term that's helpful to know is loss. Loss represents the amount of chaos in the model. The higher the loss, the less accurate the model is, which is ironic maybe because a poem with a great deal of loss in it is quite moving. With each epoch or iteration, the loss grows smaller. Ideally, we want a loss of less than 0.1. Depending on the dataset, this usually occurs around the 600th iteration or so. Further training will not make the model more accurate. In fact, it will lead to something called overfitting, which is when the model begins spitting out chunks of the text that are identical to its training dataset. Early on in training, it's clear the model has problems, but later we begin to get better results. Okay, looks like the training's done. The next step is to create our voice model. To synthesize an accurate voice model, we need 4 audio clips of the speaker's voice, roughly between 5 and 10 seconds each. I'm using the same audio from the video clip I played earlier. Although the real-time voice cloning repository is very powerful, it does have its issues.
Along the bard, here we go again, stumbling upon a new type of song, an ancient melody with a touch of Arabic, with the wailing children.
When I split the poem into single lines, things seem to get a little bit better. And we're done. Here's the finished product.
Here we go again, stumbling upon a new type of song. An ancient melodrama with a touch of Arabic, a wailing child on a silver plate. Another poet reciting lines from ascension from which we shall never fall. What we do or miss or cast out eases one by one were taken from one of the poems, or taken from all the poems. How are you feeling? Stories float by. Mischief taints your cloud, and you are advised to juggle your affairs as you are guided. How do you feel? Dressed to be felt? What you do or say reflects this or that. Object, feather, or noose. Something small is not welcome. Here we go again. Stories wade through mud and rain, ghost or reality. Matter or shadow, thing or other, and find their feet within a stone's throw.
Not bad. The spoken voice is far from a perfect copy, but the poem, I would argue, has some strikingly beautiful parts that seem to echo Nye's style. Maybe you don't agree with me. Voice, after all, is a notoriously subjective quality. And here's where I'd like to transition into exploring some theory. What I call voice can also be understood in relation to what the poet Garcia Lorca calls duende, dark sounds, the mystery, the roots that cling to the mire that we all know, that we all ignore, but from which comes the very substance of art. Lorca elaborates on his ideas of duende in a speech in which he regards it as a foundational aspect of creativity, the rich loam in which art derives its energy and essence. In his speech, Lorca distinguishes the duende from the angel and the muse. The angel dazzles but flies over a man's head. The muse stirs the intellect. The true struggle is with the duende. In fact, Lorca spends much of his time discussing what the duende is not. In a similar fashion, voice defies tidy classification or simple definition. It is largely ineffable. Roland Barthes, in his essay The Photographic Message, has some fascinating theories that are related to the quality that I'm referring to as voice. Of the photographic image, Barthes says, it is a message without a code, from which proposition an important corollary must immediately be drawn. The photographic message is a continuous message. By this, Barthes means that the photographic message resists analysis. It cannot be deconstructed in the way that other texts are traditionally deconstructed. The components are too vast, too varied, and too numerous. In another of Barthes' essays, Structural Analysis of Narrative, he comes to a somewhat different conclusion about narratives. Either a narrative is merely a rambling collection of events, in which case nothing can be said about it other than referring back to the storytellers, the author's art or talent or genius, or else it shares with other narratives a common structure which is open to analysis no matter how much patience its formulation requires. Notice Barthes' mention of the storyteller's art or talent or genius in this passage. It sounds very similar to the quality I'm calling voice. When Barthes wrote these essays, his analytical toolbox was almost completely analog. It was well suited to the analysis of narratives, but he recognized its limitations. He considered the photographic message to be a continuous one and claimed the special genius of authors defies analysis because he simply didn't have the digital analytical tools that we now have. Now we have algorithms that can parse images and extract data, a prime example being facial recognition software. These same algorithms can also be trained to learn and reproduce human voice. The continuous and therefore unmappable message can now be deconstructed, studied, and reassembled. Which brings us to one of Barthes' most well-known essays, The Death of the Author. In it, Barthes argues that the popular notions of authorship are outmoded and don't account for the performative nature of language itself. Barthes says that writing is a special voice consisting of several indiscernible voices, and literature is that neuter, that composite, that oblique into which every subject escapes, the trap where all identity is lost, beginning with the very identity of the body that writes. The author to Barthes is merely incidental, a vehicle for the creation of language. Once an action is recounted, the voice loses its origin, the author enters his own death, writing begins. Barthes downplays the author, but he uplifts the reader. The reader is the very space in which are inscribed without any being lost all the citations a writing consists of. The unity of a text is not in its origin, it is in its destination. It can be argued that Barthes was prescient in his insight that language itself is the true performing subject, but I don't think he could have anticipated a future where we would be able to build self-refining language models that can imitate human voice. Whereas The Death of the Author was a helpful schema for Barth's theory, I argued that we are fast approaching an age where both language encoding and decoding will be largely disembodied. The death of the author and the death of the reader will become less a theoretical construct and more a technical reality. In his essay, What is an Author?, Michel Foucault arrives at a different conclusion while largely using Barth's same premises. Foucault acknowledges that the point of writing is not to manifest or exalt the act of writing, nor is it to pin a subject within language. It is rather a question of creating a space into which the writing subject constantly disappears. He goes on to note that the mark of the writer is reduced to nothing more than the singularity of his absence. He must assume the role of the dead man in the game of writing. So far, so similar to Barth. The difference comes in Foucault's estimation of the cultural value of the author. Foucault asks, how can one reduce the great peril, the great danger with which fiction threatens our world? The answer is one can reduce it with the author. The author allows a limitation of the cancerous and dangerous proliferation of significations within a world where one is thrifty not only with one's resources and riches, but also with one's discourses and their significations. The author is the principle of thrift in the proliferation of meaning. In Foucault's theoretical framework, the author is the anchor of meaning. Without the author, the cancerous and dangerous cloud of meaning threatens to overwhelm us. This is largely the anxiety provoked by artificial intelligence. If we can no longer discern between authentic, by which I mean human, and inauthentic, by which I mean artificial intelligence works, then we lose Foucault's necessary anchor. We are set adrift. All is not lost, however. Scholars and researchers are studying exactly this sort of thing, and one of the more prominent societies is the Electronic Literature Organization. This is from their website. What makes the work that the ELO does absolutely imperative in this digital information age, as scholar Paul Ceruzzi calls it, is its leadership in developing methods for evaluating quality of digital, creative, and critical works, and its insights into cataloging the growing body of digital fiction, poetry, and other literary forms. For the ELO is the only scholarly body in the US dedicated solely to the investigation of literature produced for the digital medium. The evaluation of quality in digital, creative, and literary works will be of the utmost importance as we move into a future shaped by artificial intelligence. I'm going to conclude this presentation by playing 3 more examples of poetry written and spoken by artificial intelligence. We'll begin with Robert Frost.
2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler.
The sound of snow. I went to turn the light of this early autumn morning on, sleeping all the night, and I began my journey loud and clear, with the footsteps that came back to me under the mountain sky, where they ran as lantern like across the fields and the country road to light the following day. The fields were half built with straw, and half spiked with pine and other trees that had grown erect in ground, or had fallen to the way as if they were dropped grasses in a fire. Snow stood between the boughs and the grounds, and the trees that had kept the grass from the time to grow old and weary and happy.
Next, Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Love is not all. It is not meat, nor drink, nor slumber, nor a roof against the rain.
When the whip is up, and you are flowing in the rain, and your song is loud, and your smile warm, and the train goes somewhere cool, and when you grow old, and become dust, I can see you, your hands small as beads, all fine, and all vibrant, yellow, and pale and vibrant. In my arms I can gather faint flowers from the ground.
And finally, T.S. Eliot.
Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table.
I was too afraid to walk alone toward the door, but I hear the soft beat of feet in the narrow streets of the city, and I see the brown-eyed men who were once bitten by the eagle's wings, and how the brown-eyed women look for sleep rough and afraid on the floor, and how the dawning was with ailing Casca upon its throne and Anastasia on its breast. Let it be, that life may lead slow and steady, beneath the images of an empty head and wonder at the strength and beauty of man. Let go of the images of night and day, and tooth and claw and foot, Let go of the impure gut and root and branch, and this and that. The only way left to us is death, the devil's dog, trampling our every twist and turn as the night goes by. I lift my glass and read between snickers. And Anastasia Lange decor singing from a cloth bag wrapped in a mallet.
We are still probably a long way away from artificial intelligence being able to write any original work that compares favorably with the quality of work that can be produced by human authors. The GPT-2 framework does a pretty good job of mimicking the essence or the voice of a poet, but the logic behind the language of the poems it creates is still lacking. Given more data, more time, and more human verification of quality, however, that flaw will shrink. I do not think there is cause for grave concern now, but I do believe artificial intelligence will continue insinuating itself into our lives and literary theory in the near future, and this will be the cause of some anxiety. But it will also cause us to think more deeply about language and the quality of voice, and that is never a bad thing. Thank you for your time.